You are a complete disappointment. We spent a fortune raising you, and this is how you repay us? Pregnant? You're a wasted investment. Leave. That's all my father said to me on Christmas Eve in Montgomery, Alabama. He didn't ask if I was safe. He didn't ask about the baby. He just stared at me like I was rotting food, and with one sentence erased 27 years of bloodline. My mother didn't flinch. She just sipped her Riesling and kept scrolling through her phone. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I placed the wrapped box I had for him on the kitchen counter, turned around, and left the house without a word. Forever. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I want to know who's part of our family here. 3 years later, I'm 30 years old and I'm the vice principal of a prep school in Charleston, South Carolina. It caters to the kind of families who think tax brackets are personality traits. My job is to outstare billionaires in overpriced suits who demand grade changes for their kids. I don't yell, I don't fold. I just recite policy until their egos collapse. Turns out, surviving your own family is the perfect training ground for dealing with entitled strangers. When my grandfather, Alfred Reyes, died last month, I didn't just lose the one person who loved me unconditionally. I inherited a war. He left me everything. The construction business, the cash reserves, the property investments. $9.1 million total. He skipped his only son completely. He knew what was coming. Just like he predicted, my parents, Walter and Clarissa, didn't show up at the funeral with grief. They came with subpoenas. They accused me of manipulating a fragile old man into disinheriting his own blood. They called it undue influence. A lie so bold I had to respect the creativity. But I didn't react. I didn't go online to clear my name. I didn't respond to news articles hinting at elder abuse. I did absolutely nothing. This is the strategy of going still. When a predator attacks, its senses are drawn to motion. If you run, they chase. If you strike, they bite. But if you stop completely, they get cocky. They think the fight's over. They let their guard down. That's when you strike. So I let them say I was the villain. Clarissa told everyone at her tennis club that I seduced an old man for money. Walter made vague posts online about betrayal and snakes in the garden. They changed the locks on my grandfather's house and filled the garage with their cars like it already belonged to them. I didn't flinch. I didn't file a cease and desist. I just watched. Because while they were busy celebrating, I was sitting with Maddox. Maddox isn't the kind of lawyer you call for paperwork. He's who you call when you want to burn everything down legally. He sat across from me in a frosted glass office in downtown Charleston, flipping through a file I'd been building since the hospital. He looked up and said one thing: they got sloppy. He showed me a photo of Walter wearing Alfred's vintage Maserati jacket at a poker room in New Orleans, spending money that wasn't his. They thought I was that same girl who walked into the snow pregnant and alone. They were wrong. Maddox leaned back and said we don't need a trial. We just need to get them to lie on record. To understand why I'm about to destroy my own parents, you need to understand how my grandfather actually died. It wasn't the stroke, it was the silence. 2 years ago, when the call came that he collapsed at the warehouse, I ran red lights all the way to Memorial East Hospital. Not because I was reckless, but because the man who taught me how to ride a bike was alone. But when I reached the ICU, there wasn't a doctor waiting, there was private security. Clarissa was behind them, fixing her lipstick in a compact mirror. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even tense. She looked annoyed, like the hospital was interrupting her spa appointment. She saw me, snapped the mirror shut, and gave me the thin smile I'd had nightmares about since I was a kid. She told me they had emergency guardianship now, and that I was no longer welcome. They locked me out. For 6 months, they held power of attorney like a weapon. They didn't sit with him. They didn't hold his hand. They hired private nurses and stayed at beach houses while he faded. I parked in that hospital lot almost every night, looking up at his window, wondering if he knew I was trying. But here's what they didn't know. They thought they cut off his communication. They thought he was powerless. But Alfred Reyes wasn't just a man, he was a storm that built himself from dust. 3 days before his stroke, we sat on his porch. He handed me a heavy, leather-bound binder. It looked like a family photo album, but there were no photos. There were ledgers, there were passwords, there was an encrypted USB drive taped to the back cover. He told me they were just waiting for him to slip, and that if he got sick, they'd come for the accounts. He told me not to fight them head-on, just to watch and write it all down. So I did. While they were playing king and queen at the hospital, I opened the binder. I logged into the back end of his business systems using the access he gave me. I couldn't freeze the accounts because of their guardianship status, but I could monitor everything. I watched them drain his empire while he lay helpless. I saw the consulting fees. I saw fake repair charges for buildings that didn't exist. I watched them buy jewelry and write it off as office expenses. In 6 months, they stole $2.2 million. People always ask how they could do that to their own father, how they could live with themselves knowing he was dying alone. But this is narcissist math. People like Walter and Clarissa don't see people, they see performance assets. When a person stops producing, when a father gets old or a daughter refuses to obey, they don't feel sadness, they feel insulted. Alfred's death wasn't a tragedy to them, it was an overdue payday. In their minds, they weren't stealing, they were collecting interest on the burden of pretending to love him. They thought the inheritance was their compensation, they didn't realize it was their trap. And now I had 2 years of receipts, and I was done watching. The day of the deposition didn't feel like a legal event, it felt like a coronation. I stood on the courthouse steps in low heels and a neutral blazer. Walter pulled up first, sliding into the reserved lane in Alfred's vintage 1960 Maserati. He adjusted his silk tie, stepping out like a man accepting an award. Clarissa followed in a black designer dress and the emerald necklace Alfred had promised me on my 25th birthday, the day they disowned me. They weren't mourning, they were rehearsing victory. They spotted me near security. Clarissa's gaze dropped to my shoes, that same old sneer curling her lips. She told me I looked tired, asked if I was still shopping discount. I told her I live within my means. Walter chuckled, twirling keys to a car he didn't legally own, and told me to keep it short, they had lunch plans. They thought I was that same girl who walked out without a word. They didn't realize I'd spent 3 years running a building with narcissists in khakis and plaid. I wasn't here to argue. I was here to close the gate. Inside the deposition room, everything was gray and cold. The videographer prepped his equipment. Maddox sat next to me, expression flat. He didn't look like a predator. He looked like someone waiting for his dry cleaning. That's his greatest trick. Walter and Clarissa sat across from us, spreading files like they were staking territory. Their lawyer, a man named Silas Blackwood, opened his briefcase with the flair of a magician.
He slid a single piece of paper across the table and said his clients were being generous. He said they understood I was emotional, grieving, maybe confused, and to avoid embarrassment they were offering a settlement, $10,000. Walter leaned back, smug, told me to take the cash, pay off my debts, go on a trip. Just sign the waiver admitting I coerced Alfred, and they'd forget the whole thing ever happened. $10,000. That was the price of their silence, the price of my dignity. It was such a specific insult, it almost impressed me. But I didn't flinch. I didn't tear the check. I looked at the number, then looked at Walter, and I said no. I told him I didn't want his charity. I wanted the truth. I pushed the check back across the table and said, "Let's go on the record." Clarissa rolled her eyes, told me if I wanted to be humiliated on camera, fine. They had nothing to hide. I glanced at Maddox. He gave the smallest nod. They were smug. They were overconfident. They were exactly where we needed them. Maddox cleared his throat and said he was thinking about withdrawing my petition, that I didn't want to drag this out, that I was willing to step down as primary beneficiary if it meant peace. Walter's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but Clarissa was practically glowing. Maddox continued, saying that for Walter and Clarissa to be approved as estate executors, we'd need to skip probate delays. That meant they'd have to formally attest to their financial competency and involvement. Walter barked that of course they were competent. Maddox opened a folder and pulled out a thick affidavit. It stated that over the last 2 years, the entirety of Alfred's illness, they were not only guardians but active financial managers, that they had personally overseen and approved every financial outflow from the company. Silas paused. He said they hadn't audited anything yet. He warned them not to sign. Sterling was smart. He smelled the trap, but Maddox knew exactly where to press. He calmly explained that if they waited for an audit, the estate would remain frozen for 6 to 12 months. That meant no access to the assets, no executive commission. When Clarissa asked what that was, Maddox explained that active managers are entitled to a statutory fee of approximately 5% of the estate's value, payable immediately based on current valuation. That was a liquid payout of roughly $250,000. The silence that followed was total. I watched the greed bloom across Clarissa's face like an infection. $250,000, immediate, untaxed. Walter's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and I saw the color drain from his face. From my angle, I could just make out the contact name, Reno. The message read, "Payment due, noon." Walter was desperate. The loan sharks weren't waiting on probate court. He needed cash now. He looked at his lawyer and said there was no need for an audit. Silas tried to stop him, said signing meant accepting full liability, but Walter snapped. He claimed no one knew the business better than he did, that he approved every expense himself while Alfred was on his deathbed. He sneered at me and demanded the document. They both signed without hesitation. They swore, under penalty of perjury, that they personally approved every financial transaction over the past 24 months. Maddox accepted the affidavit, smiled, and reminded them they had just testified under oath. Clarissa stood, ready to leave, but I stopped her. I pulled out the black binder Alfred gave me, the one that mattered more than a last name. I flipped to a monthly vendor listed without fail, Clarwall Consulting, $15,000 a month. Walter claimed it was logistics. Clarissa muttered that they'd already verified it. I calmly revealed the company had been created 3 days after they assumed guardianship and was registered to Carla Dean, Clarissa's esthetician. I showed Instagram photos of Carla and Clarissa on a yacht, geotagged to a business retreat in Belize. Matching earrings, matching timestamps, matching betrayal. I told them they'd created a shell company and funneled $360,000 while Alfred withered in a hospital bed. Walter shouted entrapment. Maddox stayed seated and explained reality. Either they just lied under oath or they confessed to felony embezzlement on camera. Clarissa lunged for the document. Maddox slid it out of reach. Walter's voice cracked. He asked if this could be fixed. I told him it couldn't. I said this wasn't civil anymore. It was criminal. That's when Walter confessed. He said he'd taken a $3 million merchant cash advance against the company. He'd burned it at casinos, underground tables, all while Alfred was comatose. He said the estate was empty. Maddox grinned. I leaned in. Walter had signed those loan agreements as CEO and owner, but the company hadn't belonged to Alfred for 5 years. He had transferred the entire enterprise into an irrevocable trust. I was the trustee. The assets Walter pledged weren't his to borrow against. Maddox delivered the final blow. Because Walter used collateral he didn't legally own, the confession of judgment clause triggered automatically. No court, no delays. The debt defaulted straight to Walter's personal holdings. His phone lit up like a siren. Bank accounts frozen. Foreclosures in process. Liens activated. The Maserati, the lake house, his pension, gone. He hadn't bankrupted the estate. He'd bankrupted himself. The doors opened, officers stepped in with warrants for elder abuse, financial fraud, and grand larceny. Walter didn't resist. As they cuffed him, he looked at me and whispered my name. I told him I couldn't help. I'm just a vice principal. This was out of my hands now. That afternoon, I walked through Alfred's estate. The trust protected every acre, every dollar,
every memory. The 9.1 million didn't erase my childhood, but it gave me safety. It gave me silence. I changed the locks, I deleted their numbers, and I let peace settle in for the first time in my life. I wasn't celebrating money, I was reclaiming peace. Most people scroll past stories like this. The ones who subscribe are the ones trying to change something inside themselves. If this made you stop scrolling, subscribe to get more stories like this every day.